Well, hello again. And now we are back. I am honored to have Linny Hainsworth with me for our fireside chat. I will start with reading the necessary CLE introduction points. The panel's been approved for 0.5 New York State CLE credits in the area of professional practice, both transitional, non-transitional, suitable for experienced and newly admitted attorneys. If you're in person, make sure you sign on your way in and on your way out today. And if you're joining virtually, keep a listen out for the magic code that will be announced at a secret and yet undisclosed time. So, on to business. I am honored to spend a little time today with Linny Hainsworth, a true force in the field of cybersecurity business strategy and technology. Linny sits on several different corporate boards of directors, including for ADP, Micron Technology, Eastman Chemical Company, and Truist Financial. She's also a federal appointee for the Department of Defense, Defense Business Board. Linny, in her capacity, has served for public company boards on the Audit, Technology and Governance, and Sustainability Committees. She also has nonprofit board service. A true powerhouse operational leader with extensive background, having operational responsibility in her career for multiple $1 billion plus divisions. Linny was a former sector VP and general manager of Northrop Grumman's Mission Systems sector, and led engineering, supply chain, and product development for Northrop Grumman's space sector, and all sorts of super cool, fabulous things. You can read details in the bio and online, but let's get down to our chat.
I was going to say, yes, stop, please.
All right. I could just say, hey, here's Linny, she's a rock star. Listen up,
Thank
right?
you.
So thank you for making time for us.
Thank you.
Linny, one of the important things in cybersecurity is we talk about that it needs to be an interdisciplinary function. You're an engineer, I'm a lawyer. How do we address this big problem facing companies today? What advice do you have for boards, for management, for others in terms of cutting down some of the barriers to ensure good conversations about cyber risk?
So your question brings to mind a few thoughts. It takes me back a little bit because in my career, it was a rare engineer who was technically deep, able to chat and debate with their technology counterparts, who could then go up the chain and have a conversation that was business oriented and consumable by the executive leadership. And so that ability to traverse those paths and translate the technical conversation into business discussion is really important and rare, and something I personally had to learn. So I would say one is for technical people to very much keep their heads up to what's important in the business, to understand the business, be able to communicate about the business and the impacts to the business. And if technical people do that, executive leadership and board leadership, they just love those people. We love those people because it takes the mystery out of the technical depth of discussion. So I'd say it's a great opportunity. The other thing is, I think non-technical executives have to understand the technology, at least to the degree that they understand what the key choices are, what the key investments are, what the trades are, and who needs to be participating in the discussion.
Awesome advice, thank you. What else can you share for people who are interested? We have a real diverse audience of corporate board members, professionals, students here with us today. For people who are interested in cybersecurity in any of those capacities, some key steps of either breaking into the field or just getting better at asking the right questions in whatever role they may have.
Sure. So first of all, let me just foundationally say, I'm not a CISO. I've never been a CISO. I've been in a business, an engineer who developed for years satellites. I've been in a business that was founded in technology and engineering, who eventually had to run businesses that were cyber businesses in a company. And so for me, being that person meant something that happened over my whole career, which was taking on roles that I didn't fully have depth in and learning. So I would just say be a learner and dive into the critical kind of current day challenges of cyber and learn what's going on today. This would be a great example. But not only available this way, right? There's lots of different forms and ways to come up to speed on what's current and challenging. The other thing is I would say hang out with those who are the professionals. You know, if you want to learn, I don't know, to be an advanced swimmer, you don't do that by hanging out with skiers. You go and find an advanced swimmer to give you guidance and counsel. Hang out with those people who are the experts and hear and learn how they translate that challenge to business.
And given what we heard on the prior panel in particular, and generally the importance of cybersecurity regulation and regulatory oversight, do you think that it is important or necessary for boards to have cybersecurity experts, and what type of experts?
Well, it's interesting you say that because there's a lot of conversation on boards about whether a cybersecurity specific expert should be hired. And I don't necessarily think that's required. I think again, lifelong learning, people who dive in, technology in a general way is important, but also being very confident and capable about going out and getting input to the board. I mean, a prime example is your prior panel. You know, Melissa Hathaway is a great resource for corporations and boards. I've personally experienced that myself. And so there are lots of ways for board members to understand, but they have to actively engage in seeking that understanding.
And you serve on many different boards in different sectors, the financial services sector, the technology and people management sector, the chemical sector. Are the cybersecurity oversight challenges and priorities the same, different, or some combination?
There are some fundamental things that are just the same. Like, do you know where all your assets are? Do you know what they are? Do you know who has access? You know, how are you controlling all of that? The fundamental, you know, the things that were talked about earlier, patching, the basics, those are the same. There are some things that are different, though. For example, if the company's global versus just a U.S. company and what that footprint might mean in terms of risk. If the company has access that's more, I'll say, commercial and public facing versus a company that's very isolated and doesn't have that. So the risk posture might change based on what's going on inside that company, but some of the fundamental things remain.
And what are your thoughts on the new SEC disclosure rules?
I knew we were going to talk about that. Because I would say it's a conversation in every boardroom, and it has been for months. And I would say that it brings an opportunity for an increased level of engagement with the board. And I believe that the board should be engaged in that kind of conversation. And not only in discussion, but in practice. So for me, again, I'll use my swimming example because I'm trying to learn to be a better one. Practice really makes a difference. And practicing together with the management team is really healthy. It's healthy to see how the management team is making these decisions. It's healthy to have the discussion about what we think about how we think about materiality versus not. It's healthy to understand when the board is going to be brought into and officially notified and what that criteria is versus maybe more informal notification. And so let's just say it is a hot topic and remains one, but it's healthy for the company and it's healthy for the board to have those discussions in preparation for what I know is going to be a flood of new disclosures.
Well, in terms of that discussion of engagement and asking questions, one of the challenges that often comes up is how involved and in the weeds should a board member get. And as a new board member, I know there's a lot to learn, and I want to make sure I'm fulfilling my oversight duties. but also not be in the way
Right.
or overstepping the role of a corporate director. What advice do you have?
Well, let's see. I'd say for new directors, that's a challenge. The transition from operations to being a director whose, fingers are not inside the tent is a challenge. And I would offer that directors can seek counsel and guidance from their peers to help make sure they make that transition, I'll say, more smooth. However, for me, the process of making that change from an operator to a board director was discipline. And that meant that I wrote down every question I came up with. And as a technology person in the tech space, that was a lot of questions. But I didn't ask all of them. And so I just created this process for myself to discipline myself around prioritization and making sure that there was good process and governance and leadership and resources for the management team to make decisions and recommendations. And then every now and then, if I really my gut told me something wasn't right, I'd have an offline conversation so that it didn't derail board meetings, and fundamentally, I didn't surprise executive management in meetings. And I purposefully still try to do that because, as you might imagine, some areas are just hot topics of interest and some are at a different level. But I would think the same challenge exists for a new CFO transitioning in, or a new lawyer transitioning in, and in your area of expertise, just being kind of disciplined about prioritizing the discussion.
Great advice. Thank you. Carolyn Welshins on our last panel talked about qualitative and quantitative assessments of cyber incidents.
Mm-hmm.
How involved should the board be in that? And is there a certain cadence of communications to know that there is the right amount of escalation and the right amount of focus?
So let's just say I have exposure to a variety of ways that companies are doing that. Some have specific qualitative materiality, I'll say entry points, not a standalone metric, but an entry point after which the board or members of committees are notified. And that could be level of disruption or dollar impact or those kinds of things that Melissa mentioned earlier in terms of how a company might be impacted by a cyber event or a cyber incident. I have companies that purposefully don't have that. And so each conversation is unique and each conversation is different. And then the group thinking around what really is material is addressed incident by incident without that previously identified kind of gating number or number of days. What's important, so both of them work, but what's important is being really clear about what it means to be in a situation where the board needs to know, whether that's impacting customers and how much, whether that's impacting business operations in terms of number of days, or whether that's going to impact the company in terms of reputation, or even individuals in terms of leadership at the company. So that understanding is pretty clearly documented from many of the companies that I support. And again, each time we try it out, the muscle gets stronger. Each time we practice, it gets easier to go through that process.
And given the tremendous amount of scrutiny that CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, have faced recently, both regulatory pressure and other pressure, and the fact that it's just a really hard job, that you're constantly defending, the bad actors only have to get lucky once, whereas the CISO's job and the organization's job is constant vigilance. Do you have any words of advice or encouragement to help organizations best manage that CISO relationship with the board, but also with others among the executive leadership team or people throughout the organization?
Sure. So first of all, I would say I personally have a lot of concern about that community. And I personally engage with that community where I can. So I find forums to just, I'll call it again, hang out with the experts, hang out with CISOs, and hear what's on their minds, hear how they're addressing problems, hear how they plan to talk about it with their boards. And so for me, that's helpful, but it's also a way for me to understand how, I'll say, stressful the role is, and maybe even perceived by them to be more risky now than ever. And so for me, that means having a conversation with the rest of the board around how we are engaging with that community and the company, to talk about insurance coverage for CISOs as part of the executive team, regardless of where they sit in the structure under the CEO, to talk about accessibility in terms of how the CISOs get access to the executive team and what that looks like. You know, is that, again, a once a quarter, here's a chat or a report, or is there open door kind of communication with the CEO and the leadership team? Is that a situation where they are listened to and that the risk around cyber is understood by the executive management and not just something that happens, I'll call it, down in the IT CISO basement, right? That it's part of the day-by-day execution discussion of the business.
Switching gears to our panel after our chat is on artificial intelligence, AI risk and opportunity. Is it a major disruptor, a major asset? How are you thinking about this, or how should companies be thinking about AI?
Well, you know, again, another area where every company talks about that, right? This is not, I don't think a meeting goes by where it's not part of the discussion. And as you might imagine, it was really part of the discussion when GPT, you know, kind of took off. So, you know, those conversations now are both on the risk and the opportunity side, both sides, understanding the potential, I'll say, business growth opportunities for companies utilizing AI, and then talking about what those use cases are and the governance around them. So we have discussions about use cases. We talk about how those use cases are governed. We talk about how the company is managing not only themselves, but their supply chain through this process, which is another, I'll say, significant risk in that domain. So yes, it's a hot topic. Yes, it's talked about on both sides of the equation, and I think it should be. And then the other thing that I had just found as a best practice is one of my board companies regularly sends out, I'll call it a fly sheet, but it's more than a page, but it's not a book, of training to the board on AI-specific topics. So when this whole big wave of conversation came out about AI, we got a few pages, right? And then that's the kind of prompter for some informal board discussion around what the whole team is learning. Back to your conversation about, now do we need an AI expert on the board? Well, no. You know, but does everybody on the board need to understand some of the fundamentals and basics and the risk picture and the risk profile for it? Well, yes.
And to best understand those basics and risk profile, are there particular questions with regard to AI, but really generally with regard to managing risk, recognizing that innovation is necessary as a leader? You want to grow and innovate and expand, but at the same time, how do you know the risk is responsible and appropriate? And as part of the board overseeing that, are there certain questions to ask or to get comfortable with the risk appetite of the organization?
Yeah, and I think there are, but I don't think they're unique necessarily to cyber, but in a broad way. You know, what are the, residual risk. Which ones of these risks are not controlled? And if we experience the uncontrolled risk, what does it look like? What does that mean to us? And then what does it cost and how long will it take to get it controlled? You know, these risks, as we agree to take them on, maybe to advance our growth potential or competitive position, what are we carrying? What risk burden are we carrying in that window of time that we may have exposure? And being very clear about what that exposure is. The other thing that's important to me is to be able to have a conversation about gaps that I'll call them skin knees, right? So I just don't know anyone who hasn't had a problem with a cyber incident in their company of some kind, right? Albeit minor maybe, but something. Do we really know why? And the why can't be 52 applications we just bought from somebody else. Do we really know what the failures and the failure modes are in the company, and be able to talk about them relative to residual risk? And I think when companies are excellent, they do that well across the board. They look at themselves in a really kind of through a tough lens, and understand where their failures are and where their gaps are. And then we can have a conversation that's open about what risk we really face.
Getting back to our first question about the interdisciplinary nature of cybersecurity. You know, one of my favorite things about this event, both for the speakers and the audience, is just the diversity of experiences.
Sure.
Really, and the diversity of opportunity within cybersecurity. Do you have any career advice for people who are interested, you know, in this space from different backgrounds, how they may best leverage the opportunities that cybersecurity presents?
Well, let's see, I'd say kind of back to the start of our conversation, you know, when I started working, part of the transition in my career was to do different things and to get exposed to just different jobs, in some cases, roles that I had no prior experience with. And part of that was learning how organizations work in different places, learning how different leaders work, and what's important to those different organizations in the context of the whole corporation. I would say cyber is kind of like that, because it's important to the whole company. It's important at an enterprise level, but every leader is going to see it through a different lens as it relates to what matters to them. So I would say think about it in the context of the enterprise. Think about it in the context of businesses that are supported by the companies that you want to work with. And then back to the other conversation around learning, to continue to just learn and then apply that learning by leveraging the people that you engage with. You know, engineering is a team sport. It just is. So is cyber. And being able to leverage people from different perspectives and being able to communicate with them is important.
I have a whole list of questions for Linny, but I want to hear from the audience if you all have questions for Linny. I'll start with you, and please speak loudly so that we can, and I'll repeat the question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. So I'm curious, from a board perspective, what are, we talked about the SEC disclosure. What else are like the top 3 or 5 cybersecurity concerns that you're hearing in board conversations?
Great question. So from a board perspective, we hear a lot about the SEC regulations, but what are the top 3 or 5 concerns?
Sure. One is aged equipment, so the tech debt and the cost of closing that gap. One is resources in terms of humanity, and both domestic and international, and how to sometimes make that trade and balance where you are going to put your teams. Another is the translation of all the data to a high level risk conversation, and I would say that is common. because it is a challenge. So I've personally been asked to identify what's really important to talk about. And I think that's something the board and the executive team, particularly CISO, should engage in. The other is probably cost in the general sense. You know, how much risk versus investment is the company willing to bear? And then in some industries, there's a lot of engagement with regulators. So, you know, as you might imagine, that dynamic is different across industries. And so, you know, I mean, at the board level, as well as at the management level. So there's that conversation as well. You know, all the other things are kind of everything else in cyber, right? Are you actively working on having non-passwords? Are you working on having zero trust? Are you, you know, all the other things that are just part of everyday cyber conversations? Those have to be brought into the discussion too.
Sorry, one more quick question. Is the discussion around AI controls part of that
Yes.
as well, or is that kind of too far out?
Oh, no, the AI controls are now, but they're not just part of cyber conversations.
Next question?
All right here.
Yes, sir.
Okay. As a representative, I'm finally a White House fellow for this year, long time. But I have military background, not veteran of West Point or just the Marine Corps Blue Mile, during the Coast Guard. But I have a question about if one pursue, I was at NYU Institute of Engineering, and would one pursue another degree in ESI, security data science, now the CIA hires data scientists. What would be a PhD after that, after data science and cybersecurity? And what about sextortion? One of the lawyers talked about sextortion, and a lot of that cybersecurity is that sextortion.
So there's
What's the question?
a lot to unpack in there, and in terms of further opportunities on education, we can talk off.
If one gets a DS in cybersecurity and has some data science, there is no PhD in data science. It doesn't exist.
I'm going to take your question and sort of make it a broader for the audience, and then we can talk after about some more detail. But Lindy, this really is a great question of how much training does someone need to be good in cybersecurity, and what are some of the opportunities for training, or how do you even know what all of the issues are to know then what kind of training you may need, in addition of coming today, of course.
Well, as you might imagine, in addition to coming today, and the master's program in cybersecurity.
Yes.
As you might imagine, that dynamic is changing rapidly, right? So data science is certainly some element of the team. It's a multidisciplinary team. A lot of the folks are cybersecurity trained people in our cybersecurity teams, but not all, right? And some of them are purely IT people with software backgrounds, right, who transition into cybersecurity teams. So I would say it's a multidisciplinary team still, and some folks have made their route through cybersecurity who didn't come with a cybersecurity degree. I am not clear about what happens after you get a master's program in data science in terms of academic preparation, so I'll leave that one to you.
There's lots of different things that we could take another whole time on, but in the interest of time, I don't know if I properly asked or covered, but how did you get into cybersecurity?
Well, let's see. Like I said, I started as an engineer doing space work, and I'll call it I don't want to say victim of, I'll say the recipient of a highly controlled cyber environment at my company. So anybody who works in aerospace and defense has come into that world knowing their idea of privacy and self-control and using their own assets in the workplace was never part of your life. gave that up at, at the start of the day when you joined that world. And so that was my first exposure, is just being in it and knowing all of the constraints and the rules around it. And then later on, running businesses, and the business delivered cybersecurity capability to, as you might imagine, the regular agencies that you would expect would be our customers. So that's kind of how I came to understand what was involved in delivering capability to customers.
Well, Linny, always wonderful. Thank you so much for making time
Thank you
for us
for
today.
having me.
So thank
I'm
you.
glad to be here.
Thank you.